Hey everyone, welcome back to Deciding to Love. I'm your host, Nathan Holritz, episode number 4. And as I mentioned last week, this week's episode is going to be very topical in nature. From time to time, I want to share my perspective or experience on a key idea, or what I'm going to refer to as a pillar for the show and for the sake of building a great long-term romantic relationship. And today's key idea or pillar is that of honesty. Now, this is a loaded topic, certainly one that we can't cover in complete detail in just one episode, but I wanted to get us started today, and we're certainly going to continue to delve into this topic in future episodes. Honesty. Why does honesty matter if we want to build a great long-term romantic relationship that we continue to enjoy? And the answer to that could be really multiple reasons, but I'll start with a couple. First of all, a great long-term romantic relationship that is truly fulfilling necessitates intimacy. And intimacy necessitates really absolute honesty. So that's number one. Number two, if we're going to, at any point, assess and improve on our relationship, at whatever stage we may be in, again, it requires honesty. Or an honest assessment, I should say, of our behavior, and then how we might improve on that behavior, and then the active improvement of that behavior. All of that requires honesty with ourselves and honesty with our partner. Now, what does dishonesty look like in the context of romantic relationships, at least in most cases? Well, fortunately, in many, if not most cases, at least on an individual basis, it's not super serious. They're what we call, culturally, white lies. Lies nonetheless, but white lies. We're trying to avoid hurting somebody's feelings or maybe avoiding potential conflict. So, for example, our partner comes to us and says, "Hey, what do you think about this new outfit?" Internal response is, doesn't really fit your body very well, or that color just doesn't really seem like you. But the response that we give to minimize the possibility of hurting their feelings or to minimize potential conflict is, "Oh, looks great. That looks really awesome on you." That's a lie. Let's be really clear. I understand the intention is to minimize potential conflict or issues or even hurting the person's feelings. Still a lie. Another example. "Hey, I noticed you're a bit off today. You just don't really seem yourself. Are you okay?" Internal response is anything but the actual response, which is a lie in the end. I'm doing good. I'm really okay. I'm totally fine. Nah, nothing's really wrong. I'm good." The person in many cases is probably avoiding the potential for conflict. In the past, this conversation has led to conflict, or they may be avoiding vulnerability, exposing potential insecurities, things that they're struggling with, they don't want their partner to know about for one reason or another. These are just a couple of examples of how dishonesty probably most commonly plays itself out in the context of romantic relationships. Now, of course, there are plenty more serious examples, hiding cheating, hiding addiction, or otherwise. But the question is, how do we go about addressing this topic of honesty in the context of romantic relationships more intentionally, more proactively, for the sake of building a great long-term romantic relationship? And I think that we really need to approach this from two different angles. First of all, we need to consider honesty as it relates to our relationship with ourselves. Are we being truly honest with ourselves? That's number one. And then we need to look at honesty with our partner. Now, honesty with ourselves. Why is this important? If we're going to have a great long-term romantic relationship, we need to bring the best version of ourselves to that relationship. And in order for that to be possible, we need to be honest with ourselves about our behavioral tendencies, the potential shortcomings associated with those behavioral tendencies, and then how to go about addressing those shortcomings. A number of years ago, it became really popular, actually, very trendy, particularly in the photography industry, to take personality tests and to take Enneagram tests. And it was kind of a fun conversation with friends. What was your number and letter and wing this and all the, of course, technical jargon associated with these various tests. And it's not that they didn't carry any benefit. At the end of the day, these were summaries of our behavioral tendencies. Potentially helpful for us as individuals if we're not naturally inclined to study personal psychology. Certainly helpful in the context of giving a quick summary assessment of our behavioral tendencies to somebody else, family, friends, or maybe even a potential employer. But unfortunately, the tests also played into another common human tendency, which is to look for answers, and then when we find those answers, to move on. Humans like answers, particularly to big questions about life. And one of those most common questions is the question of, who am I? Now, I don't think that's a great question to begin with. We'll save that conversation for another day, but it's a common question nonetheless. Who am I? And in order to answer that question, somebody might take one of these personality tests, or they may take an Enneagram test, and they accept the answers that they get from these tests as really the end all be all. This is, quote, who I am. I've landed on who I am. And that's kind of, unfortunately, where the conversation stops. There's this kind of figurative sigh of relief. I figured out who I am. And then the person moves on with their life. And by the way, this isn't just limited to test taking. You hear in conversation with other people quite commonly, I am fill in the blank. I am high strung. I'm really low key. I'm a type A. I'm a procrastinator. And on and on and on. I'm A, and then fill in the blank. People like to give themselves a label, and yet again, the conversation tends to stop there. There's little consideration of whether or not these behavioral tendencies are adding value to our lives personally as individuals, and whether or not they are beneficial or not to those around us, especially our romantic partner. It's just, this is who I am. But yet again, the honest conversation that we should be having with ourselves is, first of all, what is our behavioral tendency or set of tendencies? But are these behaviors helpful to us? Are they helpful in the context of a romantic relationship? And if the answer to either of those questions is no, then the honest assessment of what needs to be done to address those negative behaviors for the sake of improving our lives as individuals and certainly improving our romantic relationship. So that's honesty with ourselves. And let me just give a couple of personal examples here. Years ago, I would have called myself an introvert. In fact, this is another common I am phrase that you hear. I am an introvert, or I am an extrovert. All that label does is represent a particular set of behavioral tendencies. I don't necessarily argue that there may be some genetic component to this particular tendency, but at the end of the day, most behavioral tendencies are learned for a set of reasons. And in my case, when I said I'm an introvert, what that represented was, particularly in the context of public events, professional public events, where I was going to industry get-togethers of one kind or another, particularly more large gatherings or loud gatherings, I would get tired being in those events after a certain amount of time. And, whether that was 20 minutes or 30 minutes, 40 minutes, after a certain amount of time, I'd physically and or mentally feel tired, exhausted, and like I needed to literally leave the room, walk out. This behavioral tendency, the feelings that I got in the process, are quite common to what people describe as introverted behavior or introversion as a whole. This happened multiple times over for me, though, and I don't remember the exact trigger at this point, but something in me made me want to figure out the reason why this was happening, and probably ultimately just because it was so frustrating. I was regularly at industry events, and I'd go into these events, and I'd just kind of get exhausted by the process and need a break. Long story short, I took a step back, did a pretty thorough assessment, and realized that the reason that I was getting so tired in these events, it wasn't because I wasn't capable of having conversation with people, meeting new people, reconnecting with old friends, etc. It was actually because when I was going into these events, in many, if not most cases, I was putting on a show. I was trying to behave in a particular way that I thought would make me cooler in the context of that particular event. And that's actually what was exhausting. So once I stopped trying to put on a show and instead focused in on one-on-one conversation in the context of those industry events, I actually remember the specific instance where I realized how effective that shift in mindset was. I was in a hotel suite in Vegas for an industry event, an industry party, lots of people. There may have even been a loud band, but certainly loud music in the background. And I was able to sit down with a longtime industry friend in the context of this noisy, crazy, kind of chaotic environment, have a discussion, and the music even kind of faded away in the background because I was just so honed in, so keyed in on just having great conversation with this individual, rather than trying to put on some type of cool persona for the sake of just coming off cool in this particular event. In hindsight, it sounds ridiculous. But this is an example of what it means to be honest with ourselves about this label that demonstrates or that describes a behavioral tendency or set of tendencies. Actually being honest with ourselves, taking a step back and saying, what does that mean? If we just stop at the label, that behavior is going to continue in our life, good or bad. That's not helpful to us. The honest conversation to have with ourselves, the honest assessment is, what is this behavior? Okay, now I realize the behavior. Is this behavior helping me achieve my personal goals? Is this behavior helping me achieve a better relationship with these friends, or in the context of this show, a romantic relationship? And if not, then what do I need to do to address that? And of course, one of the most effective ways to address an issue is to understand the root of it. So being willing to put the time and effort and energy into understanding where this comes from a psychological standpoint, getting professional help if I need to from a therapist, talking to close friends and family that I can trust to get objective, honest feedback from, figuring out the root of that, and then addressing the issue. That's what we're talking about here when we talk about an honest assessment of ourselves and our behavior, the root psychology, and ultimately, of course, this enabling potential change. Another personal example, attachment styles. Attachment styles in the context of romantic relationships are usually made up of two primary categories: anxious attachment style and an avoidant attachment style. As I alluded to in a previous episode, I have an anxious attachment style. Now, I could have gone through my life just continuing to repeat that phrase over and over again. I have an anxious attachment style, and then try to find somebody who may be similarly unhealthy to accommodate me in the context of a romantic relationship with that anxious attachment style. But I don't think that's an honest approach to self-improvement, and as a result, I'm not going to be bringing my best self to a potential romantic relationship. So I began work, honestly, years ago, as I made the effort to understand what it meant to be codependent and how to address those tendencies, very much related to this idea of an anxious attachment style. And then the work has continued even up into recent weeks, where I've made some pretty big breakthroughs as it relates to this particular topic. But it takes a willingness to see the thing for what it is, in this case, a negative behavioral tendency, do the homework to understand where it comes from, and then look for tools that will enable you to make improvements on that particular behavioral tendency. That's honesty with ourselves that enables that kind of real change in our life. And again, a better person in the context of a romantic relationship. So, honesty with ourselves, that's the first place that we need to start. Number two, though, is honesty with our partner. Now, the reason that honesty even matters in the context of a romantic relationship, it really comes down to one word, and that is the word trust. We talked about intimacy earlier. In order to have intimacy, you have to have trust. And in order for there to be trust, I would suggest there needs to be absolute honesty in your relationship. There's really no reason why you should have to, quote unquote, have to lie or even tell a so-called white lie in your relationship. The question is, why are you doing that in the first place? And I think it comes down yet again to just one word. The underlying motivating factor for being dishonest in our relationships, it's fear. On a surface level, fear of maybe potential conflict, or even I don't want to hurt this person's feelings, and as a result, maybe I avoid potential conflict as well. Maybe fear of exposing personal insecurities, fear of change or loss. The list of fears could be quite long, and it's going to be dependent on the individual psychology. But nonetheless, fear is the driving factor behind dishonesty. So if we want to address the dishonesty and thus encourage trust and encourage the potential for intimacy in our long-term romantic relationship, we need to address the underlying fear or fears that are driving us, that are pushing us to want to be dishonest in the moment with our partner. Now, just the topic of fear is a loaded one, and certainly not one that I'm fully equipped to help you with. I would encourage you certainly to look to friends and family if they're able to give you objective and honest feedback to help you address your fears. That's great, but ultimately go for professional help. Look to a therapist to help you address your fears if need be. But if you can address the underlying fears associated with that motivation to be dishonest with your partner, you can then begin to address the dishonesty. You can learn to be more consistently honest, and as a result, open and vulnerable with your partner, encouraging trust and thus intimacy. So that's the topic of honesty. And again, we're just covering it here at the surface level. There's so much more to get into, and we're certainly going to touch on this topic endlessly in upcoming episodes. But what are your thoughts? Let me know your thoughts, your experiences, even your questions if you've got them as it relates to intimacy, or as it relates to honesty and the potential intimacy in your relationship. If you're watching or listening on YouTube, on Spotify, or even on Apple Podcasts, make sure to leave a comment, and I'd love to get your take. Be part of this conversation about honesty in the context of long-term romantic relationships. All right, thanks for listening to this week's episode. Next week will be a bye week. I'll be taking the week off, spending some time with family. But the following week, we'll be coming back, hopefully with our first couple interview, and you can look forward to that. Thanks again for listening to Deciding to Love. If you haven't already, make sure to like, if applicable, depending on the platform that you're on, but certainly to subscribe to Deciding to Love.